And so I'm going to turn it over now to Professor Oliver Boyd-Barrett and let him go on and explain to you his thesis.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate your words, and I really like the way that you introduced the topic, contrasting the hopes that we had for the internet and against the reality, as we realize every day more, that we're more and more vulnerable to the games of propagandists who are generally much better resourced than we are. So I really liked that as a starting point, Jeff. I want to thank the Cleveland Peace Action for the privilege of being able to talk about these issues with you today. It's a great privilege, it truly is. And I appreciate it beyond words. You know, talking about war and US involvement in war is not a particularly pleasant subject. And it makes many people, including myself, very angry when it's not making us feel very sad. And one of the things that I have appreciated about the peace movement in general, and a good many of those who are active in that movement, is that they have a very good understanding, a native understanding, sharper than mine, as to both the advantages or the necessity, but also the dangers of anger. And so as I tread into this area, into this topic, that's very much in my mind. Anger is necessary, but it has to be controlled, and it has to be directed, and it has to be subject to rationality and to moral choice. So what I'm aiming to do with the time I have this evening, and good evening to you all, it's still late-ish afternoon here in California, I'm going to provide you with a broad summary of my argument based on this particular screen that you're looking at. Then I'm going to apply that argument to some of the major issues and concerns that we have about US involvement in the Middle East. That's going to include, I hope I'm managing my time correctly, but I want to talk about Africa, I want to talk about Afghanistan, I want to talk about Syria and Libya and Iraq, not necessarily in that order, of course, and also Iran. So that here's the basic structure of my argument. I want to put this within the framework of a history that I expect many, if not all of you, are quite familiar with, which is the framework of US interventionism in its foreign policy and in its military policy. It goes back before World War II, but we can safely start it at World War II. Many people will argue there was a short period of interruption to this narrative after Vietnam. I'm not totally convinced about that, but perhaps there was a relative lull for a few years after that time, and it continues today. And what I have to remind myself, as well as, and perhaps therefore reminding some of you, is when we're talking about US interventionism, of course, we are often talking about US interventionism, military and otherwise, in the affairs of countries of the South, sometimes referred to as countries of the third world or the developing world, if you like, but also interventionism in the first world as well. So amongst my memories of this history of US interventionism, I recall US meddling in the elections, post-war elections of both France and Italy to keep the European communist parties under control and to prevent them from winning power. I recall the attempts to stage coup d'etats in the first world amongst the supposed allies of the United States. So we have a fascinating, but I see it's There is an attempt to tell this story in the Netflix series, is it? The Crown?
Oh, yeah.
But there was this attempt to stage a coup d'etat against the Labour government of Harold Wilson, who was in power from 1968 and 1976, and he was subject to pretty much continual harassment of one kind or another from his own intelligence services, backed, I'm sure, and with the full knowledge of US intelligence. We have the astonishing story of the Greece, the intervention in Greece, which brought to power, which was a coup d'etat against a democratic regime, and brought to power a military junta that controlled Greece from 1967 to 1974. The story is brilliantly told by William Blum, who is a scholar of interventionism, and he recounts how pretty much the entire Greek political and military establishment before, during, and after this period was controlled by the CIA. And had reason to remind myself just recently of intelligence meddling, US and NATO against the Labour government of Jeff Whitlam in Australia in 1975. So, and there are other instances as well. So the basic message is, gee, if the United States can meddle with them, what hope have the countries of the South and of the so-called Third World? And then as we look through the list, William Blum has 50. I think it should be closer to 100 instances. But some of these are very, very significant. These are forms of interventionism, I would argue. Not all of the ones that you can see on the screen, but many of them are forms of interventionism, I would argue, which, had they not occurred, the world would now be significantly different. I'm thinking particularly of the assassination of Lumumba in the Congo. I'm thinking of the overthrow of the founder of an independent Indonesia under Sukarno, followed by the massacre of about 500,000 supposedly left or left-inclined citizens of Indonesia. We've got the shooing in of Saddam Hussein in 1980, just within a few months of the embarrassment, the great embarrassment to the United States of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And lo and behold, a few months after that happened, much to the shame and to the chagrin of the United States foreign policy establishment, we find Saddam Hussein is in power next door. And what is the first thing that Saddam Hussein does from Iraq? He invades Iran. How incredibly convenient is that for the United States foreign policy establishment? I remember, as we just been celebrating, not celebrating, of course, I should say, but mourning the events of 9/11, 2001, but many people also quickly want to add, well, don't forget the significance of the Pinochet coup on 9/11, 1973 in Chile, which some would regard as the first major experiment of neoliberalism. And the Chicago School, the success of Chicago School economics and all that implies. So the list goes on, as you can see, and you will want to add your own memories to that list. I recall such a surprise when, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990 to 91, and then during the 1990s, the approachement of China to the World Trade Center, the clear evidence that China was wholeheartedly embracing capitalism, and many of the things that go with capitalism that include gross inequalities of wealth. You might have thought at that stage, as did I for a while, that perhaps the world really was changing, and that there would be no cause, there would be no reason for US interventionism anymore, at least not on the scale that we had seen it during the Cold War. But of course, that was not to be. And so that raises the question, what was the Cold War really? A very interesting question that an ex-CIA analyst, Stockwell, asked a few years ago. Was this truly a propaganda battle between communism and capitalism? or was it, as he argues, was it actually a struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States for the third world? And I think that's not a bad argument. I think that that's an interesting argument, which helps us to begin to understand perhaps why the struggle then didn't come to an end, even after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990 to 91. But I don't think even that is a sufficient explanation, to be quite honest with you. I think we're simply talking about a very, very long-standing drive within, what do we call it, the elite? Do we call it the deep state? Do we just call it the plutocratic class? Plutocratic corporate class? Do we call it like Ray McGovern does, the Mickey Matt, his restatement of what we used to understand by the military-industrial complex? It's a struggle for hegemony that is driven by a lust for profit and money and power. I think that, to my mind, gets us closest to the real driving force that is at work when we try to understand U.S. interventionism for the past 50 years or more. And then we come to the issue of, we see the retreat, the alleged retreat of the United States from Afghanistan. And you hear the same kind of conversations going on as we heard when the United States retreated from Vietnam all those years ago in 1975. And there are murmurs that perhaps we'll see combat troops withdrawn from Iraq. Perhaps we'll see them withdrawn from Syria. Does the removal of combat troops mean the end of interventionism? Certainly not, because the United States has so many different forms of interventionism that it practices. But perhaps we could take some comfort that we're going in a good direction. And I want to address that question towards the end of my talk this afternoon. So without more ado, I just want to quickly summarize, because I won't have time to look in detail, or as much detail as I would like, at the various examples of US interventionism in the Middle East. So I want to jump to what I see are the constants. When we bring them all together and we're comparing and contrasting, what seems to stay the same whenever we're looking at an example of US interventionism in the Middle East. Here they are. I've got 8 of them. The pretexts that are given for war, for interventions, are almost, if not always, false. Increasingly, these pretexts weaponize ideologies of human rights and women's rights and similar concepts, or responsibility to intervene, because they know that these notions play well to the gallery. Human rights generally don't improve as a result of US interventions. Women's rights generally do not improve as a result of these interventions. So they're duplicitous, the claims are duplicitous, and they don't accomplish much, if anything. Sometimes they are, as I say in a moment, counterproductive. Increasingly, the wars are wars of perception, management, and propaganda. And these wars are fought through think tanks, human rights organizations, so-called non-government organizations, which are rarely non-government. They're usually totally dependent in one way or another on government funds from one source or another. And of course, the mainstream media. Throughout conflicts, both from before they start and during the conflicts and after the conflicts are over, the US government consistently lies, big time. 5, the mainstream media of the United States and of its NATO allies generally act as, in these matters of foreign policy in particular, as stenographers to power. And they do this in a wide variety of ways, but perhaps most importantly, they do it by only showing you a very slight view of the context within which these conflicts occur. We'll definitely be looking at examples of that. And also when they do bothered, or when they do deign to recognize that there is a narrative that is opposed to the official narrative, the opposition narratives are generally and badly misrepresented. Oh, my numbers are wrong. I'm so sorry. This should be 6. So actually, I got 9 of these constants. The only winners of these conflicts are what Ray McGovern has called the Mickey Mat: military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. That is a mouthful. It's not as simple as media industrial complex. It does get at the fact. It does get at the fact that there are now so many pigs at this trough, and that is making it more and more difficult for the peace movement, or anybody else for that matter, to have a hope of unseating what I sometimes refer to as the incubus, this huge monster that is strapped to our back, and we don't know how to undo the strap. We haven't quite worked out how to do that yet. And this monster, this incubus, has swallowed approximately, you see different estimates, but these come from quite good sources, a total of $7 trillion since 2001, of which the defense industry has consumed or gobbled up half. Those are the people who win. Everybody else loses. If you have any sensible criterion of what could constitute the welfare of the American people, let alone the global population, of course, or if you have any sensible criterion as to what global or national security might constitute, well, in those terms, most of these conflicts, if not all of them, are hideously counterproductive. We in the United States and in most of the NATO countries are saddled with a foreign policy that looks feudal. It is feudal. It's a hybrid of Machiavellian realpolitik that its practitioners somehow think of as being smart and intelligent, but which is actually really, really stupid, I'm going to argue. A hybrid of Machiavellian realpolitik and ideological fundamentalism that reeks of the superiority of white Western civilization. There are solutions out there, and the best way that I can express it is a wholesale cultural revolution, because this is about culture as much, perhaps more about culture, the culture in which we live and which has been fashioned largely by others and imposed on us. A cultural revolution that is opposed to militarism and all of its consequences. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is my broad argument. And now I want to illustrate some aspects or some facets of that argument with respect to some of the particular conflicts that have occurred over the past over the past 2 decades in the Middle East. Okay, so Afghanistan, of course, is very fresh in our minds. I don't think it's unreasonable to encompass Afghanistan within the broad notion of Middle East, both because of its geographical proximity, also because of its largely Muslim or Islamic character, and the relations that exist between the United States and NATO and Afghanistan. So I want to quickly argue about context. Mainstream media and most narrative, the fashioners of narrative, official narratives, like us to forget the depth of this narrative and our own complicity in the dragons that we then claim to be out to slay. So we go back to 1979. The monarchy of Afghanistan was overthrown in 1973. It was followed by some years of civil war and a number of different coups d'etat, which had best been left totally alone, because it would have sorted itself out quite certainly within a few years. But of course, because the pro-Moscow Taraki regime took power in 1978, The United States considered that its interests were now deeply implicated because Russia was in the picture. President Carter's national security advisor, the totally wacky Russia-obsessed Brzezinski, came up with the policy of deliberate destabilization of the Taraki government in Afghanistan. Why? Deliberately, in order to seduce or to induce a Russian invasion of Afghanistan. That was the policy. Russia invaded Afghanistan because we destabilized the Taraki regime in order to induce Russian intervention to protect the pro-Moscow lobby in Afghanistan at that time. And Brzezinski boasts about this. For him, this is an amazing, clever, diplomatic, covert operation in concert with the CIA. And of course, once the Soviets are in, then we have a wonderful game we can play with Pakistan, with the Saudis, in creating a resistance force to the Soviets. So together with these guys, with some help from Israel, some help from some NATO powers, we go in and we create a form of the Mujahideen. I mean, they'd always been there in one form or another, but we strengthened these forces. We supported warlords. We supported those who were later to be members of the Taliban. And above all, with the help of US intellectual anthropology elites, we created a new form, a very warlike form of Sunni Islam. Its figurehead was General Zia, who became president of Pakistan, and Margaret Thatcher was a great buddy of his. She met him both in 1980 and then again in the 1980s. This is a guy, you know, almost every bit as objectionable from a Western point of view, you might argue, as the Taliban. But apparently Thatcher loved him, thought he was the best thing since, as the British would say, sliced bread, and worked with him to create a resistance movement, a religious-based resistance movement to the Soviets. So this is the period when the warlords, the Haqqani network, Massoud, Hekmatyar, Dostrum, and of course, Osama bin Laden appear on the scene. Just quickly to note in passing, the first international warrant for Osama bin Laden's arrest, where does it come from? In April 1998, it comes from Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, who, I'm going to say approximately 15 years before his own demise, is recognizing that Al-Qaeda is already a threat to Libyan interests, something that Western intelligence never wanted you to know. So the Russians are there for a few years. They get into the quagmire that Brzezinski hoped they would. They leave Afghanistan in 1989. They are quickly succeeded by a cabal of warlords who are then taken over by the Pashtun, the dominant ethnic group in Afghanistan, the Pashtun majority, from whom the Taliban are mainly recruited. There are some cries of horror when the Taliban engage in some acts of vandalism against Buddhist statues, but that's not quite so important as realpolitik. And the Taliban seem to be the kind of people we could work with, so long as they were helping us to lay pipelines, gas and oil pipelines across Afghanistan from the Caspian Sea That was the idea. The Taliban would create the necessary security and unity in Afghanistan to enable us to lay these pipelines with the help of with UNICAL. We had an astonishing visit from senior Taliban in the mid-1980s. They came out to Houston, Texas to talk business with UNICAL about getting these pipelines. And who else was in the picture here? None less than the egregiously awful Enron, which had a base down, or had a number of stations down in India. And the idea was the Caspian oil and gas would end up under Enron control in India, having come through Afghanistan. These are all things, of course, that have been largely forgotten in the official narratives, if not totally forgotten, as was the Taliban early success in controlling the opium trade. And that, of course, was reinstituted after the United States bombed the hell out of the Taliban in 2001 until, well, the opium, the flow of revenues from opium have continued to increase during US invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. So after the Taliban are destroyed by our bombs in November 2001, oh, what was it, by the way, what was the pretext that we used to invade this incredibly, one of the poorest countries in the world? What made us think that this would be a really good thing for American and masculine adrenaline, just to kill a whole lot of people from a very, very poor country? Well, the reason apparently was that the United States said within days or in fact probably before the end of 9/11 itself, that the culprit of 9/11 was none other than Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Astonishing, isn't it, that you have no idea the day before 9/11 that Osama bin Laden may have anything to do with this, but the following day you're absolutely certain that you know that he did it. How does that work? Well, the Taliban were quite amenable to the idea of handing Osama bin Laden, who of course had a physical presence, he and his Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan, they were quite amenable to the idea of handing bin Laden over. I mean, who the hell really wants to be bombed back to the Stone Age? But they were moral enough and smart enough to say, absolutely, just show us the evidence that Osama bin Laden is responsible for 9/11, and here you go. He'll be on the next plane out to wherever you want us to send him. But the United States couldn't be bothered, or perhaps did not have the evidence that Osama bin Laden was the culprit for 9/11. So they didn't provide the evidence, and we went ahead with the bombing anyway. And during the bombing, the Taliban once again offered to send, to help the United States secure custody of Osama bin Laden. But by this time, we couldn't be bothered even to talk to the Taliban. And you know, to this day, I don't believe we have the necessary evidence that would guarantee secure knowledge that Osama bin Laden is the proper culprit for 9/11. We do have a culprit in jail, as you very well know, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and he's been in jail for 20 years. Isn't this astonishing? He's been in jail for 20 years. Obama secured the right framework, as he considered, a military tribunal, you know, to make it easy. Who knows what could happen in a civilian court? Maybe there would actually be justice in a civilian court, but you kind of would think that with a military court, you can sort of control things. But even with a military court, even after 20 years, we have not got to the main trial of KSM. Isn't that just astonishing, whichever way you look at it? And many people will argue, and I think there's a lot to the argument, that the main reason for this is, well, first of all, there is nothing remotely possible by way of a fair trial when the supposed culprits have been tortured time, dozens and dozens and dozens of time have been subject to water torture. If these guys ever got to trial in a military tribunal, and even more in a civilian court, of course, the whole thing, the whole pack of cards just falls apart. So what else is happening about this time that might lead us to be slightly skeptical as to the reasons that are given for the necessity for us to invade Afghanistan by way of securing a reprisal against the murder of 3,000 of our own people in the World Trade Center and in the Pentagon? Look no further than the Project for a New American Century, established by the main neoconservatives in 1997, just a few years before 2001. And they come out with a report in the year 2000 that's called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And as John Pilger rightly noted shortly after 9/11, this report is lusting for an excuse for a reset in the way that international relations is conducted, is lusting for that signature moment, like the bombing of the World Trade Center, perhaps, as the excuse, the pretext, the false pretext, to enable America to rebuild the world in its own image. And then we find out a few years later from Wesley Clark, presidential candidate in the 2004 elections, and the military chief of NATO. So this is no mean source. And he tells us in 2004, speaking to Democracy Now!, I think is the context in which this occurred, he says shortly after 9/11, he discovered that there were plans for taking down 7 Muslim nations in the space of 5 years. We'll see who they were just in a moment. If they were there before the end of 2001, I'm pretty damn certain they were there before 2001, those plans. And I'm pretty damn certain they were very much in the minds of the leading neoconservatives who were behind Project for a New American Century. And let us not totally overlook the connections between the Bush family and the Bin Laden family through Carlisle, in which Daddy Bush still had an active interest, even as his son took his nation to war, a war from which Carlisle and Daddy Bush were going to benefit significantly in terms of war profits. And now just recently, Biden, and I'm not sure that I can fully explain this yet. Biden the other day promised, he lived up to a promise that he had made in the recent election campaign, to declassify FBI investigations documents into the Saudi connection to 9/11. I sort of thought, I kind of laughed at that because I thought, who actually believes in this process of declassification? If the people who are doing the declassifying are also the same people who may very well be vulnerable to any unpleasant, uncomfortable secrets that might be disclosed as a result of declassification. But my cynicism to one side, I have to admit, the early releases of these documents do seem to be supporting the narrative, the hidden narrative of Saudi, deep state Saudi involvement in 9/11. How amazing is that? While KSM rots, still rots in jail in Guantanamo. So I need to move on to talk about some of the other instances from. But you know, let me just leave it at this, because we don't have time, and this is not the forum, and you don't want me to, I don't think, to dig into 9/11 in this on this occasion. But now that Biden is declassifying documents relating to Saudi involvement, Remember Bob Graham, chair of the was it the Senate Intelligence Committee? He's been saying this for well over a decade. He's convinced. He's been for well over a decade. He's been telling us that, of course, Saudi Arabia was involved. Now it looks like we're actually going to see documents from the FBI that will confirm those, or at least will give further substance to those suspicions. Well, why might that be troubling? Well, it's troubling in practically every dimension that you care to think about it. But the dimension that most troubles me are the close relations that have always existed, have existed for some considerable time between Saudi intelligence. In fact, the Saudi ambassador to the United States on 9/11 became head of Saudi intelligence on his return to Saudi Arabia. Incredibly close links between Saudi and Western intelligence. So the question is, if this stuff is going on with state connections involving Wahhabi movements that have considerable support, both amongst the Saudi plutocracy, the Saudi religious establishment, and the Saudi state, that it can in no conceivable way be a secret to Saudi intelligence. And if it has no conceivable, cannot be obscured to Saudi intelligence, I don't think it can be obscured to US intelligence either. Anger and sadness are the responses to any serious consideration of these histories. So much more to say about our relations with the Taliban, but no time. So I'm going to move now to Iraq. I mentioned Wesley Clark just a few moments ago. He's the guy who reveals that there were plans to take down 7 Muslim countries in 5 years. Well, it's not just Wesley Clark we have to look to now. We actually have a credible, painstaking state-level inquiry into the Iraq war from none other. Do we have it from the United States? I don't think so. But the Brits seem to have some rather more scruple in this area. They set up a committee of inquiry, the Chilcot Committee. It took an endless period of time for the Chilcot Committee to deliberate and finally to report at the end of 2010 and publishing in 2011. But amongst the incredible documents that you can unearth in the Chilcot inquiry that totally confirm Wesley Clark's revelations, you got this record of a conversation between Tony Blair, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 2001, and George Bush. And what are they saying? Bush is gung-ho for going to war immediately with Iraq. Yeah, let's say that Saddam Hussein did it. Who needs more proof than that we say that he did it? And Bush is saying this in 2001, and Blair is saying, that could look very bad. The optics for that are not good. Now, I think maybe you need to hit Afghanistan first. So it's almost as though Afghanistan really, it was a bit of a bore, really, having to do Afghanistan. We really needed Iraq, but we had to go through this dreary process of totally destroying another sovereign country before we go and destroy Iraq. Well, this story is so familiar, I think, to many, if not all of my listeners. I'm not proposing to speak at length about it right now, but you'll know, weapons of mass destruction, Colin Powell providing the so-called evidence before the United Nations, and even Colin Powell is disgusted with himself, has long been disgusted about his performance before the United Nations in 2003. He knows that it was a pack of lies, and some of these lies came from the most egregiously awful sources that even the CIA had to put a clothes peg on its nose before living with, the so-called curveball. This is the gentleman who was supposedly an exile from Saddam Hussein regime, who knew where the weapons were, apparently, even though he hadn't been in Iraq for many years, and even though other perfectly reputable sources, including UN weapons inspectors, were saying there's no way that there is any remnant remaining of Iraq's nuclear program, and anything that remains of the chemical program, its toxicity has long ago expired. But of course, we weren't allowed to listen to those voices, and our beloved media, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, New York Times, Judith Miller, and the usual gang of Pentagon parrots in our establishment media, insisting that all we hear are the supposed threats of WMD that are still posed by Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And then immediately after, as soon as it becomes clear that this is a total fabrication, then we have the disgusting process of hearing the New York Times and the Washington Post and one or two other supposed leaders of our journalistic community, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. Oh, that was terrible of us. You're right. We really should have looked at these sources with a bit more skepticism. We should have asked a few more questions. And if only we had done that. If only we had done that. And we used anonymous sources. That's terrible. Journalists should never ever use anonymous sources. We're never ever going to do this again. Huh. Well, of course, within a few months, we saw the same guys practicing the same kind of journalistic hijinks, beating the drums again next time within months. It's not as though they had the decency to let this whole thing rest for a year. No, they could only hold their breath for a few months, and then they felt they had to do it again, had to be faggots of the Pentagon again, in beating the drums for war to help Israel convince the world, and America, of course, that Iran's nuclear peaceful energy program was a nuclear threat. Forget about Pakistan having nuclear weapons. Forget about India having nuclear weapons. Forget about Israel having had 100 to 200 nuclear warheads since the 1960s. No. What we've really got to get upset about now is the possibility that that Iran, without any shred of evidence that is going to do this, will enrich its supplies of uranium from the 2 to 3% to 90%, which is the requirement for a nuclear warhead. Even then, it requires a missile that can carry the damn thing in the right direction, which Iran did not have, and it was nowhere near having at that time. So we know all about this. The counterproductive part of this story, we installed this character, Paul Bremer. We called him a proconsul because I guess if you're going to be neoconservative, you have to be well read in Roman history. That's the thing to do. If you're going to be neoconservative, you have to know what happened to the Roman Empire. Well, no, actually, you don't have to know what happened to the Roman Empire. You have to know how the Roman Empire became as strong as it did. You forget about the bit where the Roman Empire actually collapses under its own weight and with a bit of help from the so-called barbarians. So we call him a proconsul, and we make him leader of the so-called Coalition Provisional Authority. And what does this guy do within a few months of this extraordinary, historically really odd and extraordinary elevation to power over what had been a sovereign nation state a few months previously? He disbands the entirety of Saddam Hussein's army, hundreds of thousands of men, young men. No one seems curious as to, okay, so what are these guys actually going to do for a living now? How are they going to fill their days? Are they just going to be carrying water for their grandmothers? Or might they come up with some other source of mischief for us? Questions not asked. And the result, this is one of the leading contributors, in addition to Abu Ghraib, to the formation of ISIS, which scares even us, or at least we pretend it scares us, when we're not also helping it along, because it proves to be quite useful when we want it to help bring down another regime we don't like, that of Bashar Assad in Syria. But when it's in Iraq, we do look very serious about needing to take this monster of feudal regeneration, take it down in the context of Iraq. And then Abu Ghraib, the revelations of torture in Abu Ghraib. Oh my goodness, isn't that terrible that Americans should all of a sudden be found to practice torture? I mean, isn't that horrible? Doesn't that just blow your mind away? Well, not rubbish, except unless you happen to know a little bit of history, unless the media are supplying you with a little bit of context. What did America do in Vietnam in the process of counterinsurgency? Center to any American-led counterinsurgency program is torture. And you don't have to look far for the evidence, but don't look for it in the mainstream media, unless perhaps from the Toledo Blade 25, 30 years after the events. And don't forget, McVoy's incredibly interesting treatise on how America invaded and occupied the Philippines following the First World War, and its refinement within its police forces of methods of torture. One of the best methods, actually, is to set the dissident groups against one another, sowing doubt, providing evidence that one dissident group has spied on another, has betrayed another, and before long, but you don't have to wait many days or weeks before you have these guys at war with one another, executing one another, or even within a given dissident movement, you have some executing others. What delightful fun all of this is. And we didn't have to wait until Abu Ghraib came along, except perhaps to put into practice some interesting and bizarre sexual experimentation at the same time. Libya. Someone's going to have to stop me if it seems I'm running through the clock. I now regard Libya as the weaponization of the Arab Spring. So we'd already had Tunis. And yes, I think there's some argument that suggests that the movement in Tunisia in 2010, that was a genuine uprising. I think there's some evidence to that. I myself visited the US Embassy in Tunis not very long before these events transpired. And already by that time, I smelt active enthusiasm for the possibility of some form of uprising, some form of sea change, something that would be moving Tunisia in a healthy neoliberal direction. So I just put a question mark over Tunisia, but I'll for the moment, I'll cede that that was a genuine uprising, and followed by what was, I believe, a genuine uprising in Egypt. Both of those movements, by the way, borrowing heavily from Western meddling in the elections in Iran a few years previously, with our meddling trying to get rid of the guy that we love to hate, Ahmadinejad, who was reported in Western mainstream media as enthusiastic about wiping Israel off the map, quote, which is still commonly cited, despite the fact that it was something he never said, nor was ever he would never have been stupid enough to say anything remotely like that. Given that we'd already exonerated Gaddafi, he had apologized for the downing of a civilian aircraft over Lockerbie in Scotland some years previously. Although actually, I don't think Gaddafi did it, but he found it politic to confess that he did. And he kindly got rid of any evidence of a nuclear weapons program. There was hardly anything of a nuclear weapons program in Libya when he did that, but he was just playing nice because he figured there was something to gain from being closer to the West and for permitting Western oil and gas corporations greater freedom in Libya. Somewhere along the line, he clearly annoyed some people. Perhaps he began to insist on too much by way of permission fee to Western oil and gas corporations to allow them to begin to exploit fossil fuel resources in Libya. Or maybe, and this is what I'm increasingly thinking, maybe by this time, Washington and Britain and Paris had jointly decided, wow, we got this brilliant excuse now, provided us by Tunisia and Egypt. There's this thing called the Arab Spring, and a lot of young, nice, young, good-looking young people involved with this. And look, they use Twitter and Facebook, so they must be good. Even though hardly anyone in Egypt or Libya or anywhere else in the Middle East at this time is using Twitter or Facebook. But nonetheless, we believe the narratives. And we decide this is a brilliant time to take these guys down. You know why? Because we don't like them. And they're actually quite successful in what they do, so we like them even less. Libya was the wealthiest Black African country in the Middle East at that time, and it was socialist. It provided free housing, free healthcare, free education. What more could you come up with that the West, neoliberal West, would thoroughly dislike? The only competitor for that would be, well, Bashar Assad, remnant of the Ba'athist ideology in the Middle East, whose regime, although not as wealthy as Libya, does provide free education, does provide free health care, is like Libya, is a secular country. It believes in women's opportunities. It doesn't prevent women from driving or from working, actually encourages this. All the more reason for us not to like them, because then they might even become well, maybe as powerful as perhaps Saudi Arabia. God forbid. Let's take them down while we can. So that's my thesis on Libya, and then we get to, as I've just mentioned, I'd get to Syria. I've already talked a little bit about Iran, so we can pick that up in question and answer. With Syria, here's the main deal, guys. No one remembers, and I've done a critique of the reporting of Sunday Times report. She was American, by the way, daughter of a Marine. Not too many people remember, other than those who saw a movie about her life. Mary Colvin, and her reporting both from Libya and from Syria in 2010 to 2011 is utterly disgraceful. She was actually quite a good reporter, but at this point she just becomes a tool of the neoliberal elite who constitute her main sources. And so she, along with everybody else, totally forgets the background to Bashar Assad. Bashar is the son, unwillingly, because a brother of his was killed in a senior brother was killed in a car crash, of Hafiz Assad, the father, who was the founding father of modern Ba'athist Syria. And he had come under direct threat, destabilization, very significant destabilization attempt by the Muslim Brotherhood. Anytime you talk about the Muslim Brotherhood destabilizing anybody, anywhere, anything, you're also talking about Western interest at stake, because they are the most pliable tool and have proven to be for the past 100 years in Western hands. And the Muslim Brotherhood uprising against the Hafiz Assad regime from the late 1970s, early 1980s was horrible. Many hundreds of Syrian forces are massacred. Alawite civilians are massacred. And all this is supposedly in the name of the Sunni majority of Syria, most of whom are delighted to have Hafiz Assad in power, because he is a fantastic mediator between the majority and all of the minorities. He's the guy who prevents the minorities getting together and threatening the security of the mainly peaceful Sunni. Don't forget, Syria is the one single country in the world where all of the traditional classic religions of the West have happily coexisted for thousands of years. Let us not deal with Syria lightly on these issues. And above all, let's not forget these crucial elements of context that tell us that the Muslim Brotherhood had proven itself to be Syria's enemy, and it was there before the uprisings in Syria of 9/11, before the children of Dar were supposedly imprisoned because they had written graffiti on the wall, on the walls in Daraa. They were there. Their preachers were preaching violence. They had the arms were already imported, and alongside the pro-democrats, alongside the Syrian communists and others in those early days, you had fanatic, fundamentalist, very threatening Islam. And when it talked about freedom, it didn't mean the kind of freedom that you and I mean when we talk about freedom. It meant the freedom of Sharia law, the kind that the Taliban are now lusting for in Afghanistan. But we don't like the Taliban, or we say we don't like, but we're fine with jihadist groups, and we're fine with Sharia law when it's in Syria and it's directed against a quite popular leader, by the way, Bashar Assad. So the outcome of this is we look at the Middle East, we look at the constant meddling, messing about by the United States and its NATO allies. We ask ourselves the question, is there anything that could ever convince us that there was going to be a reset, that the United States was suddenly going to be, it would experience, and this would be kind of appropriate, wouldn't it? It would experience a Pauline Damascus conversion. Wouldn't that be nice? What kind of evidence would we need, do you think, that would lead us to suppose that this is ending, that any of this is seriously ending anytime soon? I don't think there is any evidence, but we should talk about it a little bit, because one or two people do see glimmers of hope. And if they see glimmers of hope, let's look at those glimmers and see where we can go with them. Thank you for hearing me out, and I'm really looking forward to any questions that you have for me.
I wonder if Professor Barrett could tell us about, number one, this human rights group called the White Helmets. Are they really a human rights group? And then the other thing I'd like to know about is, did Assad really gas his own people?
Thank you for the question, Jeff, or the questions. So who are the White Helmets? We're told that they are a heroic rescue group that take injured and people and bodies from the wreckage, particularly the wreckage of any bombs thrown at rebels and freedom-loving fighters struggling against the Syrian Arab army. Whereas the opposing point of view, who actually looked at the evidence, say that they may be that occasionally, but what they are mainly and what they are principally is a phony, fake group that was set up not by anyone in Syria, not even by rebels in Syria, but by the British Army, by a gentleman called James Le Mesurier, who I think had very close links to British intelligence and had certainly served a long period of time with the British Army, and was funded by a so-called non-government organization called Mayday Rescue, which in turn was funded by another so-called non-government organization called ARC. I skeptically call them supposedly non-government organizations because they were heavily funded by the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And then later on, US intelligence was funding these guys, Dutch intelligence was funding these guys, all the NATO players were funding these guys. What were their main tasks really? Their main tasks seemed, first of all, to to whitewash what were otherwise jihadist groups who behaved in ways not dissimilar to ISIS in their brutality, who had no legitimacy whatsoever to the control of Syria, weren't even particularly good at political machinations, couldn't seem actually to hold a semblance of negotiation together for longer than 5 minutes. But the West helped them with public relations. We trained them and we sent people to work with them to give them a positive public relations image. Oh, and you know where we learned where to do that? We learned it from the Mujahideen in the 1980s, when the Mujahideen were defending our interests against the Soviets in Afghanistan. We gave lessons to the Mujahideen into how to present yourself in a way that looks really cool and romantic to gullible Western audiences. That's who the white, and another thing that the white helmets proved useful, and all of this is pretty fresh evidence. It's coming up in the last few months to the last year, I would say. The White House, the white helmets, interesting, that slip of the tongue. I talk about the white helmets and I can't stop saying White House. Why would that be? Well, the white helmets proved terribly useful in finding witnesses who can support claims that, oh, the Syrian Arab army have just launched a chemical weapons attack on us. Here are the witnesses, OPCW. Here they are. We've got them for you. Yeah, we've collected, and they're all, yeah, don't look too closely at who they are. They actually all come from the rebel forces. A lot of them are actually rebel fighters, but they'll do. They'll tell you what you want. And for Duma 2018, White Helmets used their contacts amongst the Syrian emigres in Turkey, and got these voices together, and then fed these voices as though they were neutral and unbiased sources of evidence of chemical weapons attacks, fed through the White Helmets to the OPCW. So that's who they are. And what was the other question, Jeff? Sorry, I've forgotten what it was.
Did Assad really gas his own people?
I have not come across evidence that shows me that he gassed his own people. I'm not going to say that he didn't, because the three most egregious attacks, chemical weapons attacks, that are mainly talked about in this context are East Ghouta in 2013, Khan Shaykhun in 2017, and then Duma in 2018. In my book, and I've dealt with each of these in my most recent book, which will be out, I hope, by early December, published by Routledge. It's called Conflict Propaganda in Syria, Competing Narratives. I don't think there's any credence to claims that the Assad regime was responsible for any of those three most important chemical weapons attacks. However, I am aware that supposed human rights organizations like the already discredited CJIA, they're already working to make claims that there are hundreds of other supposed gas attacks that took place that were the responsibility of Bashar Assad. Well, we don't know, do we? Because the only people who are making those kind of claims are people like the White Helmets and the rebels. And we also happen to know from very early on, it's been proven that the rebels themselves had access to sarin and other sources of chemical weapons. There's proof that Turkey itself became very unhappy as early as 2012 to 2013 to find that the jihadist groups who were seeking rest and recuperation in southern Turkey were also amassing toxic chemicals for export to jihadist groups in Syria. And Turkey was extremely worried about that. And not only did it come down heavily on that traffic, but it also came down heavily on journalists who were trying to report that traffic, of whom one was very conveniently killed in an otherwise inexplicable car accident. A woman, by the way.
Thank you so much for being here and for your wisdom and coming and sharing this all with us. So I have a couple of questions. One, how does NATO and Ukraine, the forged things, play into this? How does the death of Dag Hammarskjöld fit into this? How does that OBL was a civil engineer developing communities before he ever, when the infrastructures were so bombed, when he became more violent? And also, does Julian Assange fit into this?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions and very relevant to all my concerns and worries. I'll try to remember them. You may have to remind me, but I'll know. I do remember the first at least. So that was Ukraine, the coup d'état against the democratically elected president of Ukraine in 2013, 2014 by an unruly mob of people who had genuine concerns, as they always do in Ukraine, about corruption. I don't blame them for taking to the streets to complain about corruption in Ukraine. For God's sake, who wouldn't? But that movement was taken over by violent neo-Nazi thugs and the organizations, they're organizations which are nurtured in Ukraine, particularly now in this day, under the current regime. So because the Ukraine constituted such a threat to that half of the Ukrainian population that are pro-Russian, speak a great deal of Russian, follow Russian media, like a lot of Russian history in their schools, those Russophiles, particularly in Crimea, which is more Russian than anything else, and has always been unhappy about being lumped into Ukraine, they were horrified when they saw that a virulently anti-Russian regime had staged, with US and NATO help, had staged a coup d'etat to get rid of a supposedly pro-Russian prime minister. I don't think he was particularly pro-Russian. All I think he was intelligent, and he was offered a much better deal in the end, at the end of the day, by Putin than from the European Union. European Union's promise of funding and such like, which of course Ukraine then and always is in desperate need of. The European Union offer of funding came with many strings attached. Putin didn't want nothing other than continuing good relations with Ukraine. So that's what starts it. The West makes a whole big song and dance about how Russia annexed Crimea. That is a lie. Russia only annexed Crimea because the Crimean people, in a duly democratic way, invited Russia to give them protection. If Russia had truly been desperate to add to its population, to add to its power, Russia long ago would have moved to take over the Donbass. But it hasn't. And why? Because it knows that in the Donbass, people, unhappy though they may be with Kiev, they also quite like their autonomy. They don't want to be part of Russia, even though they have a great deal of respect for Russia. But what they don't stand for is the fact that Kiev, even though it's been told by the Minsk agreements to find a way of giving more autonomy to the regions of Ukraine, Kiev always finds a way of not doing that. And the main reason why it finds a way of not doing that is because it is threatened physically by the neo-Nazi movements that have actually been enveloped into the official Ukrainian security forces. So this is all of this has what are the lessons that the United States and NATO have learned from this? The lessons are all you need is a propaganda machine. And since around this time, I can see a very deliberate sharpening up of the tools of military and political propaganda across NATO for the purpose of furthering NATO and US interests, not for the people of these countries, but for their elites, for their financial institutions, for their respective military industrial complexes. Now, your second, please, can you remind me what the second question is?
Osama, the civil engineer, and Julian Assange. Hammarskjöld was first.
Okay, I'm not quite sure where you're going with the Osama bin Laden connection, other than the Osama bin Laden family had many very solid relations with the West, with the United States in the context of construction and supposed development and nation building and this kind of thing. George Bush had extremely good relations with the U.S. ambassador to, the Saudi ambassador to the United States. The bin Laden family was immensely powerful in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden has and continued for many years later to have considerable leverage in Saudi Arabia. He was a man that other members of the Saudi Arabian elite were very timid in dealing with, even if they had wanted to deal with him. So I think that's what I can say about Osama bin Laden for the moment. And then the other thing. Oh, Assange? Oh, right, right. Dan, I think the way that I'm going to leverage your memory of that wonderful diplomat, Dag Hammarskjöld, is to say, this is when we first begin to see, oh my God, this beautiful concept of a United Nations. It doesn't make any sense, does it? If the key players in the Security Council are the old imperial gang. I know they got Russia, they got China, but that's not enough to stop these kind of games being played. Do I think Dag Hammarskjöld was assassinated? Yes, I do. Do I think that this was telling us, for those of us who wanted to listen, a lot of nice stuff goes on at the United Nations, but at the end of the day, it's power that wins. And the United Nations is not the source of power. The United States, for a long time, has been the source of power. It used to share that power to some extent with the Soviet Union, and then it got very big-headed after the Soviet Union dissolved. And what do we now see? We see that supposedly sacred UN-sponsored organizations like the OPCW, they're statues with feet of clay. You've got the first director of the OPCW being threatened by the sleaze element of the US foreign policy establishment in the shape of John Bolton. John Bolton says to the first director of OPCW, "We know where your kids are." How shameful, how disgraceful. Mm-hmm. Why? Because the first director of the OPCW tells him, there's no evidence that Iran even wants weapons of mass destruction, let alone actually has them. And now later, 2018, the current director of OPCW ignoring or actually fabricating the evidence that suggests that there was never any evidence of a chemical weapon attack in Douma. OPCW weapons inspectors, or inspectors, I should say, knew that. That's what they could find on the ground. But their reports were doctored to make it look as though, yeah, there must have been. Yeah, absolutely. So what this tells us is you can trust nobody. You can trust nobody because you can't trust power. Power does what power wants or what power gets away with. We have another instance. You might say it's a smaller instance, but someone raised Ukraine. We got the MH17 fiasco still going on. It's back in court now in The Hague. The attempt to prove that, and I think it's totally false, by the way. I think the evidence is fabricated from beginning to end, that Russia was responsible for shooting down the Malaysian airliner MH17. Even Malaysia doesn't believe this. Even Malaysia thinks this is a string of nonsense. All this pretense at judicial process, it's a laugh, it's a joke, it's a charade, particularly in the international realm.
Yeah. So I want to voice a couple of questions here just quickly because we're short on time. From the Zoom audience, I will say that one of our listeners, Kathy Pottergill, says that she refers to you. She says that this lovely man is an encyclopedia, which I think we'll all agree with. But she also asks this. I'd like to know how you keep your anger in check, because right now I'm really enraged about all of the U.S. and other Western interests carnage in the Middle East.
Yeah. At the end of the day, we're all human beings, aren't we? There's no speech, I think, more beautiful than the JFK speech, the commemoration speech that he made a few months before his assassination, and may even have been the cause of his assassination, or at least a reflection of the reasons for his assassination. And he talks about the Soviet Union, and he talks about the United States. He clearly doesn't like the Soviet Union's political system or its economic system. But he says, at the end of the day, we all breathe the same air. We share the same planet. And we have just experienced a real possibility of nuclear war with respect to the missile crisis in Cuba. And he's saying, we have to get along, guys. We just have to do it, because the alternative is totally unspeakable.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think it's in that spirit, the ability to continue to love, trying to direct our anger only in productive ways. I mean, for example, it can be very easy sometimes, and I sometimes fall into the trap myself of getting very upset with the U.S. military. And yes, there are some US generals who deserve castigation and punishment, for sure. But the young men who walk into this trap because as a result of constant propaganda from the day of their birth to the day that they put their lives on the line, and do so with remarkable courage, and I think usually with good intent. I don't want to hate them.
Right.
What I'd like to do is redirect that courage and that energy into something important, like addressing climate change, for example.
A question that I think is really a general question, but sort of maybe we all want to know the answer to this. What media do you find the most trustworthy?
There's no single thing. It's a combination of both mainstream and alternative sites, both American and others that I have access to, that over time I have grown to trust or to take seriously. There's no single story that you can automatically take for granted as something dependable, but if you see it from sources that have proven to be dependable in the past, and sources which are also confirmed by other sources that you have found to be trustworthy in the past, it's a very long, or I would almost say a lifelong process. And you also have to accept the fact, and it's an unhappy fact, that there's a constant process of penetration going on. So what today may seem to be, and actually is, a very strong, credible source, may by next year have been penetrated and taken over by some other voice as a result of the exchange of money or other favors to people whom you don't actually know. So it's a very challenging, lifelong, continuing process.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, we wanted to take one more question from the library.
Good evening. And thank you out there, all of you, and thanks to those who participated here and provided this program. It's very, very fantastic and informative. I just have a simple question. I'm really outraged about all the lies the media, and especially our government, keeps feeding us. And what puzzles me is the public. And this is supposed to be a strong country, the best education, the best of everything, and yet our people are not educated. Every year we celebrate or we mourn the dead of the 9/11. Okay, we, the United States and our allies, have committed 9/11 in how many countries for the last 23 years, since 2001? Why? Who mourns these people? We say we're here for the protection of the women. We're trying to liberate the women of Afghanistan. Our military men use them and sell them, the boys and the girls, and they rape them on a regular basis. This is what you call liberating Afghanistan and the women? They were liberated before we were. Go back to the history of Islam. The women are more liberated than they are now. Our women in this country and in the West, we cry for equal rights, equal rights. For heaven's sake, women, look out there. We have been liberated for years. You just don't know it because of all the propaganda that you're being fed. And we call ourselves a nation of strong and military and all that. Nobody stands strong. And the question is, who mourns these people who died in Afghanistan in the last 20 years and other countries that we have invaded? Thank you.
Thank you. I support you entirely in your comments. No disagreement with you whatsoever. I think is in large measure a note of despair, but there is a glimmer of hope too. My conclusion after all of these years, there have been times when, at least, for example, there have been times, and it may still be the case today, I haven't seen a recent survey, it may still be the case today that 50% of the US population, they know there was a load of bullshit in the official 9/11 narrative, and they suspect there's a lot of bullshit in other official narratives. So my thinking is information, it's important, it's helpful, but there's a big, big difference between information and power. Information alone doesn't cut it. And at this stage, for me then, because I'm a scholar, I'm a professor, this is very depressing because this is my livelihood, this is my profession. I'm in the business of information. And now I realize too late, too old, well, there was never going to be a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow. No matter how much information I've got, it's not going to change anything. What changes stuff is power. And that, I go back to my original thoughts and comments. Those people who have involved themselves in peace movements, they seem to have a clearer head on their shoulders in this respect, I'm afraid, than I have. They have a sense that you have to join together in a very purposeful way to engage in the political system that we have, not the political system that we would like, but the one that we've got. Now, I don't quite know where that brings us to in terms of, are there compromises at the end of the day? Are there difficult moral choices that we would rather not have to take at the end of the day? But hey, if it gives your voice access to power, that actually changes the world in at least a centimeter in a direction that you think will be good, genuinely good for the world, then I think you're already a lot better off and doing a smarter thing than those of you like me who rest our laurels on information only.
Perhaps one more question?
In response to the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the American mainstream media began to focus on the, and I quote, message being sent to allies such as Israel and Taiwan. Do you have any thoughts on the message being sent to allies like that, U.S. allies?
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, I'm not at all happy by the kind of allies that the United States regularly chooses to work with. Of all of them, I suppose Israel is the most problematic because Israel is a nuclear power. Israel has acted shamefully and every day continues to act shamefully in attacking and killing its neighbors without excuse. We've seen various invasions, let alone its treatment of the Palestinian people on the West Bank and in Gaza, and even the Palestinians who live within the borders of Israel itself and who are Israeli citizens. They're all shamefully treated. But also we've seen Israel gladly invade the Lebanon when it feels the need to do so, unless, of course, Hezbollah hits back too hard, and then Israel scampers back behind its border and then goes off to kill other people instead. And now, practically every day of the week, it seems, you read of a Israeli bombing in Syria. Why isn't anyone in the United Nations, or why isn't anybody in the United States upset by the fact that its ally is just killing its neighbors without even pretext, other than the very unhappy pretext that, well, it looks like there are some Syrian soldiers out there who may be working alongside Iranian soldiers. So that's why we're going to go and kill them, as though Israel somehow has some kind of moral right to do this. And its attitude to Iran now for 25, 30 years, Israel has pulled every propaganda trick in the book to try to convince the rest of the world that Iran is a nuclear threat, which is total rubbish. All Iran has got is a very modest sized nuclear energy program that's barely up and running as I speak, and the chance of Iran ever becoming a military or a nuclear weapon power is close to zero. Although I will concede the fact that the Iranians who have been brought to their knees economically by the United States through U.S. Sanctions regime that go back decades, they find that if they say to the United States, hey, look, we're going to enrich our uranium by 1% more, does that scare you? In the hope that then the United States, by the way, I think the Iranians are foolishly optimistic on this point, in the hope that somehow this will help the United States see sense. But the United States is not going to do that, because why? Because the United States wholeheartedly supports Israel. It pretends that it doesn't notice that Israel has got 200 nuclear missiles. The reason that it makes this pretense is because under international law, the United States cannot aid a country that both has nuclear weapons and has not signed the nuclear non-proliferation treaty.
Thank you, Professor.
Israel,
unfortunately, they're going to shut the meeting down in a minute here at the library. I'm so sorry to say that.
Okay.
Thank you all. Thank you, Professor Boyd-Barrett, for speaking tonight. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Take
Locally
good care.
Across the country, as I see some of our participants. We know the problems. We have to unite behind our organizations, Cleveland Peace Action. We invite you to join us on our website, peaceactioncleveland.org, and join with us to remediate these issues and take the militarism out of our country.